There's something terribly wrong in Africa, and the recent military takeover in Gabon may be the turning point. Here's a list of all the African countries whose presidents have done more than a decade in power. Yeah, I know, it's a lengthy one. But guess what all these countries have in common? Some form of democracy. They also have a very high poverty rate, corruption, and yes, you guessed it, the support of powerful countries from the West. Going through this list, something struck me. Why is a country like the United States, that has been pushing for democracy around the world, also voicing support for corrupt leaders in Africa that have practically refused to conduct any form of free and fair election in the continent for over 5 decades? This was when I started learning about the corrupt business of politics and how the West has been enabling this corruption in the poorest region of the world. In this video, we're going to look into the individual stories of these countries, and you will see just how powerful forces beyond the shores of Africa have been fighting to keep the continent in shackles. This is the story of African democracy, a lie used to extract resources and keep the region poor. Okay, let me walk you through what is really happening. On the 30th of August, barely hours after this man was declared winner of Gabon's presidential elections, held a few days earlier, a group of Gabonese military officers from the elite Presidential Guard unit seized power and placed the winner of that election under arrest at his own palace. No, it wasn't a random politician. This is President 𝗪𝗵𝗲𝗿𝗲. And some of the military's reasons for removing him from power are irregularities in the election, corruption, and poor governance. For context, the Bongo family has been in the presidential palace for 55 years. No, this is not monarchy, it is a democracy, which makes it all the more interesting. President Ali Bongo's father, Omar Bongo, ruled Gabon for 42 years, from 1967 until his death in 2009, with Ali Bongo elected to succeed his father that same year. That election in 2009 and the one of 2016 and the 2023 re-election all had something in common, and that is electoral fraud. In fact, in the months leading up to the recent election, the people got so tired of the Bongo family that major opposition parties decided to unite behind a single opposition candidate, the former education minister, Albert Ondo Osah. Guess what? President Ali Bongo and his government still found a way to manipulate the process. First, he modified the electoral rules in the months prior to the election. And when it was barely days to the election, the president decided to limit the free flow of information by cutting internet service in the country. The result, the opposition candidates ended up getting just 31% of the votes. When the Election Commission declared the results of the polls, the people were angry, and within hours, Gabonese military stepped in to put an end to a 55-year dynasty. However, Gabon is not alone in this electoral fraud and poor governance. You see, it has become a thing in Africa. But let's leave the election process aside for just a second and instead take a look at the people they produce and how they've managed to build dynasties for themselves. We'll start from the Equatorial Guinea. This is a small Central African country of about 1.7 million people. After gaining its independence from Spain in 1968, this man called Francisco Macias Nguema became the country's first president in what is now referred to as the country's only free and fair election. The Spanish supported Macias because they thought he would be loyal to them and help protect their interest in the country. But the joy of independence was short-lived for Equatorial Guinea, as Macias quickly turned into a brutal dictator with no regards for human lives. In one instance, Macias had 150 alleged coup plotters executed in a purge on Christmas Eve of 1969, all of whom happened to be his political opponents. In July 1970, he placed a permanent ban on opposition political parties and declared himself president for life in 1972. At this point, he cut off all ties with Spain and the West, choosing instead to befriend Communist China, Cuba, East Germany, and the USSR. By 1974, a quarter of the entire population of Equatorial Guinea had fled the country. Out of a population of 300,000 people, an estimated 80,000 were killed by this man. There were reports of alleged genocide against the ethnic minority Bobi people. 𝗪𝗂𝗪𝗲𝗿𝗲 also ordered the deaths of thousands of suspected opponents, closed down churches, and presided over the economy's collapse as skilled citizens and foreigners fled the country for their lives. When the people got tired and cried out for a savior, one arrived in the person of 𝗪𝗂𝗪𝗲's nephew. Wait, is it like Game of Thrones or something? I promise you, this is real. On the 3rd of August 1979, Teodoro Obiang deposed his uncle in a bloody coup. This led to over 2 weeks of civil war. 𝗪𝗂𝗪𝗲𝗿𝗲 was eventually captured, tried, and executed, giving rise to Teodoro Obiang Nguema Mbasogo, the current longest serving president in Africa. Since deposing his uncle in 1979, Nguema has remained the president of Equatorial Guinea till date. And while he came in as a savior for his people, the only difference between him and his uncle is his closeness to the West, and some say he is less bloody. Also, he gets himself elected every once in a while. Here he is with former US President Barack Obama. But don't let the appearances fool you. He is a politician after all. Now here's what I mean. In 1982, Obiang amended the constitution of Equatorial Guinea, giving himself extensive powers, including naming and dismissing members of the cabinet, making laws by decree, dissolving the Chamber of Representatives, negotiating and ratifying treaties all by himself. So he is the commander of everything in this country. The Prime Minister basically operates under powers delegated by the President. In 1995, something happened. Mobil, an American company, discovered oil in Equatorial Guinea. This was, of course, a great news, right? The country's economy was supposed to experience some sort of boom. But earnings from this oil wealth have not reached the population till date. 7.9% of children die before the age of 5. And more than 50% of the entire population lacks access to clean drinking water. Meanwhile, President Teodoro Obiang has used the country's oil wealth to enrich himself and his associates. In 2006, Forbes estimated his personal wealth at $600 million. He is a career politician, not a businessman. In the 4 decades of his rule, Obiang has shown little tolerance for opposition. While the country is a multi-party democracy, its elections have generally been considered a sham. In November 2022, Obiang was re-elected in the 2022 Equatorial Guinea general election with 99.7% of the votes to continue his 43-year rule. In a democracy, that is some crazy numbers. Since August 1979, some 12 real and perceived unsuccessful coup attempts have occurred. The man is now 81 years old. But will Equatorial Guinea need another Game of Thrones moment to be free of this dictator? Now, let's head over to Cameroon. Paul Biya of Cameroon holds many titles when politics is concerned. He is the second longest ruling president in Africa, the longest consecutively serving current non-royal national leader in the world, and the oldest head of state in the world. Yeah, he is 90-year-old. Elder Paul is a career politician, having served in government since 1964. This is to say he was in government since the era of Nigeria's civil war, and still the president of Cameroon till date. But how did he manage to get this power and be unrivaled? In November 1983, Biya announced that the next presidential election would be held on 14th of January 1984. It had been previously scheduled for 1985. He was the sole candidate in that election and won with 99.98% of the vote. He has managed to win all elections in Cameroon ever since then, with oppositions usually alleging fraud. For instance, in the October 1997 presidential election, which was boycotted by the main opposition parties, Bela was re-elected with 92.6% of the vote. Bela won another 7-year term in the 11th October 2004 presidential election, officially taking 70% of the vote. After being re-elected in 2004, Bela was barred by a 2-term limit in the 1996 constitution from running for president again in 2011. But he sought to revise this to allow him to run again. In his 2008 New Year's message, Bela expressed support for revising the constitution, saying that it was undemocratic to limit the people's choices. This led to violent protests in late February 2008. Nevertheless, on the 10th of April 2008, the National Assembly voted to change the constitution to remove term limits completely. The amendment in the constitution also provided for the president to enjoy immunity from prosecution for all of his actions as president after leaving office. In the October 2011 presidential election, Bela secured a 6th term in office, pulling 77% of the vote cast. 𝗪𝗵𝗲𝗿𝗲 was his nearest rival, pulling just 10%. Bela again won the 2018 presidential election with 71% of the vote, making him the longest-serving non-royal head of state. Oh, just to add, Cameroon is a democracy, and all these elections have international observers from countries like the United States, France, and others. In fact, his regime is strongly supported by France, one of the former colonial powers in Cameroon, which supplies it with weapons and trains its military forces. France is also the leading foreign investor in Cameroon. The 90-year-old president, is unusually found in Switzerland at the Intercontinental Hotel in Geneva, many miles away from the poverty-stricken Cameroon, where he has refused to give up power. Third on our list is Republic of the Congo, also known as Congo-Brazzaville, or simply Congo, which has been ruled by this guy, Denis Sassou Nguesso, since 1997, after a previous 13-year term from 1979 to 1992. Overall, he has ruled this country for 39 years. Each election he has won has been characterized by violence and electoral malpractice, yet he remains a close friend to the West. Here he is with the Obamas in September 2009. The story of the Republic of Congo is one I would like to get into in a whole different video, as they have fought 2 civil wars, all resulting from election matters and greedy politicians clinging so dearly to power at the cost of human lives. Sassou Nguesso's capture of the Congo has led to voter suppression to the level that opposition parties no longer want to participate in the elections, like in the July 2009 presidential election, where he won with 78.6% of the vote amidst an opposition boycott. On 27th of March 2015, Sassou Nguesso announced that his government would hold a referendum to change the 2002 constitution, which would allow him to run for a 3rd consecutive term in office. The proposal was overwhelmingly approved by voters, with 92% in favor. On 28th of March 2016, Sassou Nguesso ran for a 3rd consecutive term of 5 years and was re-elected in the first round with 60% of the vote. His major opposition, 𝗪𝗪𝗲𝗿𝗲, could only manage 15% of the vote. During the presidential election that took place on 21st of March 2021, Sassou, who faced 6 challengers for the presidency, came first once again, garnering 88% of the vote. Meanwhile, his main challenger, 𝗪𝗪𝗲𝗿𝗲, finished second again, but this time around, he got just 7.9% of the vote. In case you're wondering what the situation of things in the Congo are like, corruption is rampant and widely practiced by government officials. The Republic of Congo has a specific law to combat corruption by public officials called the Law Against Corruption, Bribery and Fraud. However, in practice, the law is not effective in fighting corruption, as the law does not extend to family members of officials or to political parties. Other worthy mentions on this list are Yoweri Museveni of Uganda, who has been in power since 1986, and Isaias Afwerki of Eritrea, who assumed office in May of 1993. All these leaders have been in power for over 3 decades and have overseen the most corrupt period in the history of these African countries, with poverty at an all-time high. Yet, they've all managed to remain in power somehow. How are they doing this? In 2005, there were rumors that the then president of Nigeria, Olusegun Obasanjo, was lobbying the National Assembly to pass a law that would lift term limits to allow him run for a 3rd term in office. Even though Obasanjo would later deny those reports, close associates revealed that over 10 billion naira was spent on that mission that eventually failed. While Obasanjo might have failed in his quest to remain in power beyond the constitutionally allowed term, his colleagues across Africa were able to implement this to perfection, leading to people like Paul Biya being in power till date. Abuse of term limits is nothing new and doesn't seem like it's going away anytime soon in Africa. Take for instance President Alpha Condé of Guinea, who tried to have his country's constitution amended to allow him to run for a 3rd term, leading to violent protests in 2019. He eventually succeeded and rigged his way into office again in 2020. 1 year, however, in 2021, the Guinean armed forces arrested Condé and overthrew his government. There seems to be an established playbook in Africa where incumbent presidents force themselves on the people even after the expiration of their term. In Burundi, President Pierre Nkurunziza has been in power since 2005. He announced in 2015 he would run for a 3rd term in what his opponents saw as a breach of the constitution, which allowed leaders to rule for just 2 terms. Since his re-election, hundreds of Burundians have been killed in clashes with security forces, and 500,000 have fled abroad. A referendum in May 2018 overwhelmingly approved changes that extended the length of presidential terms to 7 years. Under the new constitution, Nkurunziza is now able to serve a further 2 terms, potentially extending his rule until 2034. In Chad, President Idriss Deby has ruled Chad since coming to power after a 1990 coup. A 2005 referendum removed a 2-term limit from their constitution. Parliament approved a new constitution in 2018, reimposing the 2-term limit, but it will not stop Deby serving 2 more terms after the election that held in 2021, potentially ruling until 2033. In Comoros, President Azali Assoumani, a former military officer who first seized power in a coup in 1999, won a referendum in 2018 to extend term limits and end a system of rotating power among the archipelago's 3 main islands off Africa's east coast. The vote allowed him to run for 2 more 5-year terms. In Djibouti, we have President Ismail Omar Guelleh. Lawmakers in Djibouti approved a constitutional amendment in 2010 that paved the way for Guelleh, in power since 1999, to run for a 3rd term in office. He has won 2 subsequent elections. In Ivory Coast, President Alassane Ouattara has been in power since 2010. He claimed the adoption of a new constitution in 2016 would allow him to run for a 3rd term in 2020 presidential race, because a new constitution would mean the first 2 terms did not count. He is still president till date. In Rwanda, we have President Paul Kagame. In 2015, Rwandans voted to extend the constitution's 2-term limit. Under the changes, Kagame would seek another 7-year terms and 2 5-year terms after that, potentially remaining in power until 2034. Kagame, who won a 3rd term in 2017, has faced mounting criticism for what human rights groups say are widespread abuses and suppression of political opposition. Kagame has been in power since 2000. In Togo, there's President Faure, who changed his country's constitution in 2019 to cap the presidential mandate at 2 5-year terms in response to opposition calls for an end to a political dynasty that started when his father seized power in 1967. However, it does not take into account the 3 terms that he has already served since coming to power in 2005, the latest of which ends in 2020. He is still president today. These politicians have been robbing their people of any good governance and have used their national assemblies to continually extend their terms, some with the aim of staying in power for life. These are the leaders that form part of the international communities like the African Union and ECOWAS. These leaders are also friends with countries like the United States and France, the advocates of democracy in Africa. All these lead to one question: is democracy still worthwhile in Africa? When democratically elected leaders can decide to toss the constitution and do whatever they like set up fake memorandums and conduct elections for themselves to remain in power till their kingdom comes, can you still question the acts of these military men who swore to defend the flag and constitutions of these countries? This is why the story of Gabon is also giving these other countries a reason to restructure their military to help their powerful leaders cling onto power eternally. Once news broke of the coup in Gabon, Cameroon President Paul Biya took steps to prevent his own removal by carrying out a major overhaul of his country's Ministry of Defense. Rwanda's defense force has also announced via social media that President Paul Kagame approved the retirement of 83 senior officers. According to the RDF, Kagame also approved the promotion and appointment of some officers to replace the previous office holders. And while Nigerian President Bela spoke about the contagious autocracy spreading in the continent, young people across Africa seem only to be worried about the continuous stay in power of these old career politicians that have refused to leave. This has led to a whole new movement and support for military-led governments across the continent. Against their better judgment, some have said it is better to be ruled by a military and know you are under a military head of state than be under a civilian rule that bears all characteristics of the military, including timeless tenures that can keep extending till the end of time. The support being received by the military governments in Africa is driving fear in the camp of the civilian governments, desperate to return to status quo. But where will this desperation lead? Thank you for watching this video. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, and do well to check out this one showing up on your screen right now, and I'll see you inside.